Hello and welcome. Putin is legalizing corruption among his cronies, and is Ukraine finally receiving Western modern IFVs? This and more in this situation report. In an interview with the BBC, GUR head Kyrylo Budanov, GUR is the Ukrainian military intelligence, said that the fighting in Ukraine is closing on a stalemate, which would only be possible to be overcome with new modern weapons coming from the West. There is an increasing number of attacks now with Shahed 131 and Shahed 136 drones on Ukraine. The Ukrainians are increasingly successful in shooting them down, but the increasing number of attacks is indicating that the production rate is going up, or that Russia has been able to buy a bigger batch in Iran. The employment of those drones makes sense for Russia, even though the majority of them are being shot down, if the financial costs for using the drone isn't too high, which from what the information of the components we can see is probably not the case. The reason for that is that even though if almost every one of these drones is being shot down, it is fixing Ukrainian troops in place, resources in place, air defense system that can thus have to, for instance, protect Kiev with short-range air defense system like the German SPAA Gepard that can after that no longer support the front line itself. So while the success rate of those drones might be negligible, the fact that they force the Ukrainians to spread out air defense all over their own country will have an impact, and will have a positive impact for the Russian side. Right now, there's also the case that the permanent air alarms that are being caused by those drones, as the drones, if they get through, do damage. And there has just been a case where a drone has been shot down, but the warhead was still intact and exploding upon impact. That means the Ukrainians are forced to do air alarms whenever the drones are spotted, and that forces the people either to get out of their beds and reduce their rest, or leave their working place to go into shelters. All of this is obviously causing a negative effect on the work efficiency, on the productivity of the Ukrainian population, both with the loss of sleep as well as the loss of working time, which is also a positive effect for the Russian side, even if the drones are not successfully coming through. But still, the GOR is expecting that Russia will get problems nonetheless. They are saying that Russia has increasing problems with the acquiring or with the availability of artillery ammunition, and they expect that until March 2023 the problems will increase and become ever more serious. Right now, according to the Ukrainians, the Russians have 11,000 men inside of Belarusia. They are with 400 pieces of equipment, like they usually say, which should probably mean tanks, IFVs, artillery pieces, but probably also trucks and things like this. In total, in Belarusia, Bryansk and Kursk, in those regions here, more or less, that would point towards Kiev. Right now, there are in total 22,000 Russian soldiers, which is more or less half as many as have been used in the attack in February 2022. So as of right now, there is no indication that an attack on Kiev is coming in the immediate future. And moreover, we have some information about the climate. This is Kremmina, so the temperatures go down to at most minus 15 degrees over the next days, which will have some effects on the front lines, obviously, too. On the Eastern Front, we have continuous fighting north of the Siversky Donetsk along the front line. The fighting itself doesn't seem to lead too much, though. The Deputy General Staff Commander Brigadier General Romov said in the last weeks, they creeped closer 2.5 kilometers in the direction of Kremmina. That is the only claim of changing territory that I could see in the last couple of days, and I have not been able to confirm this, but at least according to the Ukrainians, they are getting closer to Kremmina as of right now. He said, Romov also said something fairly interesting. He said that among the officers of the LNR, the so-called Luhansk People's Republic, there are talks, they are communicating with each other that in case the Ukrainians are capturing Kremmina and thus will break through the Kremmina-Svatove line or Svatove-Kremmina line down here, that huge parts of the Second Army Corps of the so-called NNR would capitulate. Now, this is kind of weird, because why would the officers talk among themselves that a big capitulation among them is to be expected? And what would the loss of Kremmina, when the Russians still hold almost all of Luhansk, and Kremmina is neither a decisive victory. I mean, it will destabilize the front line north in the direction of Svatove, obviously. But this is not an indication that the Ukrainian victory is about to happen. So to me, this claim doesn't make too much sense. Why the LNR would face a mass capitulation and while the officers would talk among each other. Also, we don't know if they say, oh, there might be, or if they coordinate because they actually intend to capitulate. Nevertheless, to me, it doesn't make too much sense. I would be very surprised if this comes to fruition after a capture of Kremmina. But it was said by the Ukrainian official spokespersons. So I want to report it to you, but with the appropriate amount of doubt from my side, as I think this doesn't make too much sense. In case it should happen, though, we knew it before, but I would be very surprised if big parts of the second LNR Army Corps would actually capitulate just because Kremmina was taken. Nevertheless, south of the Siversky Donetsk, the fighting is also continuing. There are Ukrainian reports that the battles around Bakhmut are decreasing in intensity. That would be in accordance to the past reports that the Russian forces there might be closing in on the accumulation of their offensive, either only Wagner troops or the whole Russian forces here. There are reports from south of Bakhmut itself. Upytne supposedly was liberated 2 weeks ago. Now we seem to be sure that the Russians have full control over it again. So the counterattack by the Ukrainians in that direction was at least partially successful, but the gains they made roughly 2 weeks ago are by now reversed fully. Other than that, fighting is continuing heavily on the eastern side and the southern side of Bakhmut itself, but no fundamental change in the front lines here. The Ukrainian side is also saying 40% of all of the Russian artillery is concentrated on the 200 kilometers around Bakhmut, which should probably be more or less that line between Marinka and Soledar up to Bilohorivka. Along this line is 40% of all Russian artillery that is pounding them, and ammunition is right now prioritized for this region. That's why the firing along the Dnipro is less than it was to be expected before that. Also, the artillery fire in Zaporizhzhia supposedly is also being reduced to allow for more artillery shells to reach the Donbas front itself. We have further south, we have the usual attacks reported around Avdiivka and at Marinka. I cannot report any change in the control of the area, though. What we do have is a HIMARS attack. They are continuing the whole time. Usually I don't see it worth reporting if the Ukrainians have destroyed 2 supply depots. Yeah, it's happening every day, and I don't want to spend more time. In this regard, it was interesting, though, that the deputy head of the Control and Investigation Department, of the Military Investigation Department, of the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation for the Joint Grouping of Troops. I have no idea what that means, to be honest. He seems to be kind of like a judicial investigator for the Russians. for the Russian military, because it's also saying he was a lieutenant colonel of justice, so not of the military itself, but his name was Evgeny Alexandrovich Rybakov, and the Russians themselves confirm that he was killed in a HIMARS strike in Donetsk city itself. So here, where the Ukrainians have obviously been able to identify a high-value target like him and took him out with a HIMARS strike, which in this regard is kind of news, as it's something different. On the southern front, we have reports about Russian attacks in Zaporizhzhia, actually. There were attacks at Doroshnyanka here. It's unclear. The Russian Ministry of Defense is claiming they captured it. Russian military bloggers before said they managed to penetrate the first line of defense of the Ukrainians. It's unclear yet whether they've captured the town or whether the town is contested by now, but it seems to be clear that there have been a smaller Russian offensive activity here in Zaporizhzhia for the first time in quite a while. I cannot confirm who fully controls it now, but there seems to be some indication that they at least have reached the town and probably entered it. The Ukrainians are saying, when it comes to the Dnipro front, basically daily small recon and sabotage troops are crossing the river, and they are being hunted then and destroyed by the Ukrainian forces. This would be an indication of the same time here, what we've seen from the Russian side, that the lines along the river are probably fairly thin, that both sides use the majority, have withdrawn the majority of their forces or are in process of doing though, and it actually makes perfect sense. While the thin lines allow small sabotage and recon troops to cross, and as there is not a continuous line of defenders along the river, there doesn't seem to be the urgent need of defending the riverbank, every inch of it, for the simple reason, if one side crosses the river, this in force with tanks, with IFVs, with bigger amounts of troops, this bridgehead is more or less an internment camp or a camp made up for destruction by the opponent's side, by the reserves of the opponent's side, unless they manage to turn that crossing into pushing the other side so far away that the whole river area is outside of the long-range artillery of the opponent's side. Which means if the Ukrainians cross the river and penetrate 10-15 kilometers, everything they have here needs to be brought over their forces on the other side of the river need to be supplied across the Dnipro, across several hundred meters of water, which can easily be intercepted and shelled. And if the Russians would do the same, it would mean the same for them. So forces crossing would be in extreme risk of being destroyed, which basically doesn't make sense at this phase of the war. So if you expect the opponent not crossing, and if you're confident that should he cross, you'll be able to actually benefit from that because you will destroy the forces that cross, then there's no reason to staff the whole river line with tens of thousands of soldiers manning every inch and trying to prevent the opponent from crossing the river just at all. So in this regard, we have a confirmation here by these reports, what we've heard in the past. It's in accordance to what we heard from the Russian side, that they are withdrawing massively from the river itself, because it doesn't make sense to try to defend every inch if any enemy penetration of your lines in force is bound for destruction. Other than that, along the whole southern front, we have artillery duels, both long range as well as short range. Long range usually HIMARS on the Ukrainian side and S-300 on the Russian side, but that's not just in the south. Obviously, the artillery fire is going along the whole front line, and it's also in regions like Sumy or Kharkiv, where there's still artillery fire on Ukrainian positions and Ukrainian settlements happening basically daily. There is an interesting Twitter, DevMom has posted something here where you can see satellite pictures from the same place. The bottom picture is from April and the higher picture is from right now, from yesterday or 2 days ago. And the interesting part here is that it's from the Kinburn Spit. And in this regard, we can actually see that there has been fighting, as we can see, for instance, the houses here being destroyed. So while we have no confirmation what exactly happened on Kimber and Spit, the only thing we heard is that the Ukrainians confirmed that they do military activity, but it seems absolutely certain that they don't control any territory on the Kimber and Spit. We now at least have visual confirmation about fighting happening there, even though that could be the results of artillery fire. I at least can't make sure when we look at those places here whether those, for instance, those small pieces here might be shell craters or not. On the Crimean peninsula, there have been two cases, one in Sevastopol and one in Charkov, where the air defense of the Russians has activated and shot at things. So according to the Russians and according to social media, Ukrainian drones are still active over the peninsula and are being engaged by the Russian air defense systems. When it comes to the mobilization, we have a press conference with Ramzan Kadyrov, and he said that Chechnya has fulfilled its quota by 254%, filled its quota. So nobody in Chechnya will be drafted in the second mobilization wave. The way he said it, at least from the translation I read it, was like he basically confirmed that there will be a second mobilization wave in as he was taking it for granted that it's already a decided thing, a done deal. The GOR said something in this topic as well. They said they expect a new wave on the 5th or on the 9th of January. So we will see within 3 days to a week whether there will be a second mobilization week wave by the Russian armed forces. The Russian Ministry of Defense has written a draft for a presidential decree that would allow heavy punishment for soldiers for various crimes, or like to punish soldiers. And the understanding of it is, when we see the English translation, field guard houses, seems to be that they want the permission to lock up soldiers somewhere in the field without having to bring them to military prisons. The implication here is obviously that it's about soldiers that refuse to fight, that show cowardice or anything like this, that who refuse orders, that they don't have to be brought back into some prison camps, but that they can just be imprisoned in place along the front line. And the BBC Russia reported this, and if they're right, then the Russian Ministry of Defense is trying to legalize the practice that is going on for several months already. And we have reports from Russia itself that there are the first problems appearing from soldiers that return from the front line. Supposedly, the acts of violent crimes are increasing noticeably already with soldiers returning from the front. I can't say who those soldiers are, if the Russians are actually letting contract soldiers leave the armed forces within a war after fulfillment of contract, but at least the reporting is that soldiers that are coming home are already increasingly involved in violent crime. There have been cases like a husband shooting his wife and then calling the police on himself, but the psychological issues are mounting. The Russian Ministry of Defense has said that it's going to provide 30 days of psychological caretaking, maybe, for the Russian soldiers after they are before they being demobilized. But it seems like this is not being done as of the moment. So the traumatized soldiers are increasingly causing problems within Russia itself. In the political sphere, there's been a very interesting development. Putin has signed a decree according to which all Russian officials, among them military and police, are now relieved of the duty to publish openly their income. So far, they had to openly say it. Now they no longer have, which will obviously make it much more easy for them to accumulate wealth without anybody raising an eyebrow, because they drive a $50,000 car but supposedly only have $1,000 income. Also, that decree actually allows Russian military to accept presents, which was not allowed in the past, if those presents are in a connection to the war. This There is some debate about what that exactly means, but it seems clear that it will allow plundering and theft within Ukraine, maybe even of real estate. So people will just claim they got this as a present and then it's being legalized on their own name. It will massively increase the possibility for corruption, obviously, which on the other hand should bind, and that is probably the goal of the whole measure, that it will bind those that accept the corruption closer to the Putin regime by the simple fact that they benefit so much from it and that they've committed crimes while the current regime is in office, that they might be too afraid of another regime taking over and then punishing them over it. So in this regard, it can probably be seen as a smart move that Putin is trying to make sure those people that can cause problems for his power are more loyal by basically opening the legal possibility for them to enrich themselves and making corruption much more easy. There's also a change in the Russian criminal law that now lifelong prison for life is possible for the support of subversive activity, for training for sabotage, or for organizing a sabotage groups. That shows that basically everyone who tries to oppose the Russian military, the Russian war inside of Russia, is from now on threatened with life in prison. And if you are part of such a group but have not neither trained nor have supported it, you're still being threatened with 5 to 10 years, which basically means everyone who knows about activities like this and has talked to people like this is very much incentivized to go to the authorities to make sure they cannot claim he was part of that and being sent to prison for 5 to 10 years himself. Also, everyone who is desecrating the St. George Band can now be sent to prison for up to 3 years and is facing a high fine. That's the orange-black ribbon that established itself as a nationalist symbol after 2014, after the annexation of the Crimea and the start of the Russian-Ukrainian war. Also, 3 Russian parliamentarians have suggested a new law that would address men that fled Russia during the war, especially if their age is according to the mobilization possibility. In that case, they would be disowned. Their property would be taken away from them. They should have a reduced possibility to work in the public sector. So I guess a lot of jobs would be banned for them from now on, and they would be forced to register as a foreign agent after that. Dmitry Medvedev said it even more radical, that he said that Russia should declare everyone who fled Russia as a traitor and should ban them, so Russia should not allow them to ever come back into Russia again. From Ukraine, we have news about a poll that was done inside of Ukraine among the Ukrainians. And according to that, 85% of the Ukrainians that participated said that there should not be territorial concessions towards Russia, even if that means that the war will last longer. So in this regard, 85% of the Russians, of the Ukrainians are willing to keep fighting and to keep fighting for victory and not bow down towards Russia. When it comes to the international support, we have one very important news. As far as I see it from the moment of recording of this video, it is not official yet. It's not officially confirmed yet or decided yet, but the Americans are considering the delivery of M2 and M3 Bradleys IFVs to Ukraine. The Bradley IFV in the M2 configuration is a classic IFV, so it's you could call it a transport tank that is armored, that has strong firepower and is capable of transporting soldiers to the front line and then staying in the fight to support them. It's a tracked vehicle. It has a 25mm Bushmaster cannon, which will allow it to engage the Russian IFVs in distances of up to 2 kilometers, and it can launch TOW anti-tank missiles, guided missiles that can engage modern Russian main battle tanks as well in ranges, I think, of 3 kilometers or maybe even a little more. The M3 is the recon version of it, which is to break it down, more or less the same, except that it's not meant to transport infantry to the front, but rather to recon, and its firepower is the same, but it carries more ammunition, including more anti-tank missiles. Instead of 7, I think it carries 12. So this would be a very important thing, as over 4,000 of those have been produced, and the American side wants to get rid of them in the near future. They're currently running a program to replace them. Several hundred of them would probably be available, which would give the Ukrainian armed forces a massive increase in firepower and protection for the infantry units, and would allow them mechanized advances under the protection of armor that is at least strong enough to withstand a 14.5 millimeter cannon. So a massive increase in the capabilities for the Ukrainians in this regard, and in this regard also the first contemporary Western IFV being delivered. As you might remember, Germany's government is very reluctant to deliver weapons to Ukraine, and one of its excuses was that Germany doesn't want to go ahead and be the first one from the West to deliver Western IFVs. Now, if this is happening now, that excuse, it's one less excuse that Germany can use to prevent deliveries towards Ukraine. So not just when it comes to the fighting power of those units, it's important. It's also important in the political sphere, as it might mean that the German government will finally be forced to send more combat vehicles into Ukraine itself as well. Also, we have one good news for Ukraine in the end. These yellow grenades supposedly are made in 2022, so they are contemporary artillery grenades that are made for the Ukrainian artillery, and obviously the Ukrainians are having an artillery shell shortage basically throughout the war, and there have lately been reports that the Ukrainians said they were able to set up a production line, and according to this, these are the shells that are arriving on the front line and thus helping to supply the Ukrainian forces. It'll obviously not be enough, but in the end every shell counts, so this is a very good news for the Ukrainian side in this regard. That's it already for now. I hope it was interesting to you. If it was, then please consider subscribing and hit the bell button. This channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you, so if you enjoyed it, please consider supporting the channel by the means in the description. Also, if you liked the video, please hit the thumbs up button and leave comments, start a conversation, which is very good for the algorithm and can be very enlightening when you, for instance, leave your considerations about the German government's reluctance to supply arms, why that is, and what is the background for that. It's quite up for debate, and any discussion inside of the comment section is obviously really, really helpful. That's it for me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.